This month, we'll be continuing our exploration of coffee varieties by tasting two examples of a very famous coffee variety called SL28. SL28 originated in Kenya in the 1930s, at a time when the Kenyan coffee industry was controlled by the British colonialist government. At that time, the colonial government set up a coffee research institute called Scott Agricultural Laboratories. And basically the idea with this was to study different coffee varieties from all over Kenya and throughout Africa with the goal of selecting, identifying, and studying varieties that hopefully would have the properties of high yield, but also excellent resistance to drought and disease. Each of the varieties that were studied during this program, they were all assigned their own individual number and also the prefix SL, which stands for Scott Laboratories. Of all of the SL varieties that were isolated and studied, arguably SL28 ultimately became the most famous. It ticked a lot of the boxes that originally were being looked for during the study, but after the fact, especially during the sort of renaissance of the specialty coffee movement, its incredible potential for cup quality has made it one of the most beloved coffee varieties in the world. While Kenya is definitely the part of the world where the vast majority of SL28 is still produced today, it has gradually been the case that an increasing number of coffee farmers throughout Latin America are beginning to cultivate this variety as well. So we have a really interesting tasting for you this month. Coffee number one is a classic wet processed Kenyan coffee that was produced on the Ngarariga estate in Kiambu County, Kenya. Coffee number two, by contrast, comes from Latin America, specifically Costa Rica, and it was produced on a beautiful coffee farm called Santa Teresa. Additionally, there's a bit of a difference in processing here. If you remember, in our first month of the Cup Tasters membership, we tasted two very different processes from the same washing station at Werka Chalbessa, Ethiopia. It's a little bit similar this month, although the processes are a little different. So while we have the same variety produced in very different places, I think that you'll find that these coffees taste very different in the cup, and I think processing will be the biggest reason why. So before we move ahead and start tasting these coffees, something that I'm actually very excited to do as my last cup of coffee was quite early this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about the specific processes that each cup represents. So let's start here with cup number one in Kenya. Kenya is actually really famous around the world for the incredible clarity and acidity that its fully washed or wet processed coffees deliver consistently, maybe more consistently than any other part of the world. This is absolutely a classic example of that process. And as a quick review, let's talk about what wet processing entails. So freshly picked coffee cherries, the fruit of the coffee tree, are delivered to a processing site. At that point in the wet process, those cherries go immediately into a pulping machine, and the fruit is stripped away. At that point, what you're left with are coffee seeds, which will become sort of the beans that we're accustomed to, but they're going to be covered with a sticky, sugary layer of mucilage, which includes a lot of fruit sugars that in the wet process need to be removed before drying can take place. And different approaches to the wet process employ slightly different strategies here. But essentially there is some type of a fermentation stage and usually some type of agitation, washing, soaking, etc. to break down that sort of sticky, sugary layer around the seeds, at which point they're ready for drying. Over here, we said a little bit previously that this is a honey processed coffee. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, because this is the first time that we've tasted a honey process in the Cup Tasters membership. With the honey process, we start exactly the same as the wet process. You have that freshly picked coffee fruit, which is delivered to the processing site, and shortly after delivery, that fruit goes through a pulping machine. What's different after that is, once that fruit has been removed from the outside of the seed, the coffee is dried immediately. So if you remember with the wet process, there was that in-between sort of sugary layer that we wanted to remove through fermentation, through agitation, through washing in channels, etc. With the honey process, at least some amount of that mucilage layer is left on the coffee seed and then allowed to dry in the sun. So it's kind of interesting, especially in a place like Costa Rica, which is internationally recognized as one of the most sophisticated coffee industries when it comes to honey processing. They get very, very specific and very detailed in the way they approach this. So their pulping machines will be adjusted with a very, very, very careful attention to detail to remove maybe a little bit of the mucilage, but not all of it. And so with Costa Rica in particular, you'll sometimes see an even more sort of specific designation in terms of the process that usually involves a color. So if you see a coffee referred to as a black honey, that usually means that a lot of the mucilage was left on before drying, and as that mucilage oxidizes in the sun, it turns a dark color. By contrast, this particular coffee that we're tasting this month is described by the producer as a white honey. That means that basically all of the mucilage was removed by the pulping machine before drying. It's very close to a wet processed coffee, but a little bit of that mucilage has been left. And definitely enough that I think you notice a profound difference in how these coffees taste. All right, well, let's see how the coffees are tasting today, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about what I'm sort of picking up in terms of the most important similarities and also differences. Starting here with cup one. Yum. I really love Kenyan coffees, and I tend to not be too much alone in that department. Although it is true that generally speaking, Kenyan coffees, because they're so bright and expressive and vibrant, they're not everyone's favorite coffee. They're a lot of folks' favorite coffee, but maybe not everyone's. When I'm tasting this coffee today, the first thing that I'm picking up right on the front end of my palate is just vibrant, juicy flavors that are set off by this very, very delightful, expressive, sparkling acidity. The flavors that are jumping into my mind right away are some kind of juicy red fruit, maybe something like red currant, maybe a little bit of raspberry. The base of the flavor profile really reminds me of black tea, and I think there's also some nice citrus going on as well. Something kind of like lime peel, maybe a little bit of lemon. There's also, balancing all of that kind of bright fruit-driven acidity, a sweetness going on here that for me kind of reminds me of cola a little bit, where you have that really pleasant, sweet, almost effervescence, and then a little bit of black tea. And savory is the wrong note, but you know the way that cola is kind of rich and sweet and sparkling at the same time? I think this coffee is a little bit like that for me. It's really good. Let's move over to cup number two and see how it is in comparison. Okay, so the first thing that I would talk about right away when tasting these coffees is mouthfeel. So with mouthfeel, I mean, we're kind of talking about body, which I think we talked about in the first month, which is sort of the way the weight of the coffee feels on your palate when you're drinking it, sipping it, etc. But I think that with these coffees, sometimes I think about mouthfeel in a slightly different sense, in the way that it encompasses aspects of body, but also aspects of aftertaste and finish. especially when you have a really bright coffee like arabica that sort of dances on your palate in a more lingering way. By contrast, this coffee from Santa Teresa is very creamy. The acidity is not as bright. It doesn't kind of dance in as lively a way, but that liveliness is replaced by this very, very soft mouthfeel that plays with the more sort of chocolatey, toffee-like sweetness that I think is just equally pleasing, but just so different. And once again, I would really, really postulate that a big reason for that difference in mouthfeel and the difference in acidity here is largely down to that processing. So the Kenyan wet process technique is absolutely going to set this coffee up to sparkle and for all of that fruit-driven acidity to stay very, very bright and juicy. By contrast, the body here is very much accentuated by this producer's decision to make a honey process coffee. And that prolonged contact between the coffee seed and the mucilage on the drying tables has really ramped up the sweetness. It's maybe tempered the acidity, made it more integrated, and really kind of rounded out the body and the mouthfeel of this coffee. In terms of flavors, I think that there are some berry notes here as well, but they're more subtle, and they're balanced by this very, very creamy, browning sugar, vanilla kind of flavor profile that it's just unbelievably creamy. I feel like I've said creamy like 4 times already with this coffee, but I really think that that's the word. Mouthfeel, body, and acidity. These are like the main areas of differentiation, I think, with these coffees. This coffee is bright and juicy and vibrant. This coffee is soft and creamy and expansive in the way that it sort of interacts with your palate. Fruit for days in all the layered ways. Over here, browning sugars, cocoa, more kind of cooked jammy fruit flavors that are more subtle and in balance. I really want to hear from you guys on this pairing because I feel like probably based on any of the pairings we've put out, this one is set up to be more divisive. And I think that's really, really fun. I really hope that some of you will reach out to members at passengercoffee.com and just let us know, what do you make of these coffees? Did you love one? Did you really not know what to make of one? Did you feel like they were really fun together? Or did you find that immediately after your tasting, you only wanted to drink them in isolation because they were a really strange pair of coffees to taste at the same time? I feel like all of those responses and many more would be equally valid, and I would love to hear from you. So thanks so much for spending some time tasting these coffees with us. Let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you again next month with another pair of delicious coffees. I'm going to keep tasting.